At my daughter's wedding, her fiancé introduced me to his boss as an unemployed loser. His boss looked at me, smiled, and said to the groom, "You are fired. I am Anthony Shaw, 70 years old. Before I tell you how I dismantled an arrogant man's life in a single evening, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect should never be tied to a bank account." The crystal chandelier in the grand foyer cast a harsh, unforgiving light on my scuffed leather shoes. I stepped toward the mahogany double doors of the ballroom, feeling the heavy weight of a small velvet box in my right pocket. A hand slammed flat against my chest, stopping me dead in my tracks. I looked up. Trevor Evans stood blocking my path. The man marrying my daughter in less than an hour wore a custom-tailored silk suit that cost more than an average family's yearly rent. The cloying, overpowering scent of his designer cologne washed over me as he leaned in close. He looked me up and down with an expression of absolute disgust. He told me I was not walking through the main doors looking like a retired janitor. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and openly aggressive. He pointed toward a narrow, poorly lit hallway leading to the catering kitchen. He ordered me to use the service entrance immediately, so I would not ruin the aesthetic of his high society guest list. I stood completely still. I looked past his aggressive posture and peered into the glittering ballroom. Natalie stood near a massive ice sculpture. She wore a designer gown that looked like spun glass, laughing with a group of bridesmaids. My daughter, the girl I had raised alone since she was 5 years old. She turned her head and caught my eye. For a fraction of a second, I saw clear recognition in her face. I waited for her to step forward to defend me, to tell Trevor to let her father in. Instead, she deliberately turned her head away and continued laughing with her friends. She chose to ignore me. That silent, calculated rejection tore through my chest faster than any physical blow. It shattered the vow I had made at my late wife's grave to protect our daughter from the coldness of the world. The coldness was not outside. It had infected her entirely. I reached into my pocket and ran my rough thumb over the velvet box. Inside rested a solid gold key to a newly purchased, fully furnished estate in the hills. It was meant to be my wedding gift to them. I pushed the box deep into the bottom of my pocket and pulled my hand out empty. I did not argue with Trevor. I did not raise my voice or cause a scene that would satisfy his desire to paint me as an unhinged old man. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked toward the swinging metal doors of the kitchen. The service hallway smelled of heavy bleach and roasted meat. Waiters rushed past me carrying silver trays loaded with expensive appetizers, completely ignoring my presence. I rubbed my hands together as I walked. My knuckles were swollen, my palms covered in thick, permanent calluses. Trevor looked at these hands and saw a failure. He saw a man who had amounted to nothing. He did not know that I had spent the last 2 decades building custom wooden furniture in a dusty garage strictly to maintain a carefully crafted illusion. I wanted to give Natalie a grounded, humble childhood, shielded from the toxic, soul-destroying greed of the financial elite. I wanted her to value hard work and honest character. I never told her that her father was the largest shareholder and anonymous chairman of Vanguard Horizon, the exact financial firm where Trevor currently worked as a mid-level project manager. I kept my wealth entirely hidden in offshore accounts and complex trusts to protect her from men exactly like him. Evidently, my protection had failed completely. She had fallen for a man who measured human worth entirely by the brand of a watch and the cut of a suit. I pushed through the heavy kitchen doors and found my assigned seat. It was a tiny, unstable table shoved against the back wall, vibrating violently every time the kitchen doors swung open. I was trapped between a stack of dirty bus tubs and the emergency exit. I sat down on the hard wooden chair. I straightened my faded tie. I watched the elite crowd mingle under the warm lights, blissfully unaware of the predator sitting in the shadows. My phone suddenly buzzed in my inner jacket pocket. I pulled it out. The screen lit up with an automated high-priority alert from my private bank. It was a transaction notification for a secondary credit card I had secretly funded months ago, to help Trevor pay off what I thought were small, manageable student loans. He was currently swiping that exact card at the venue's master bar. He had just charged $12,000 for premium vintage champagne to impress his wealthy colleagues. He was actively using my hidden money to finance the very wedding he just banned me from entering properly. I stared at the glowing numbers on my screen. The audacity of his actions erased any lingering hesitation in my mind. Trevor paraded around the ballroom shaking hands and acting like a billionaire, entirely sustained by the charity of the man he had just shoved into the service hallway. I opened my banking application. I navigated to the joint accounts, the secondary credit lines, and the emergency funds I had established under dummy corporate names to keep his fragile lifestyle afloat. With 3 deliberate taps on the glass screen, I initiated a total financial freeze. I revoked authorization for the credit card he was holding. I suspended the auto payments for the luxury sports car he leased to show off at the office. I terminated the shell company guarantee that secured his overpriced penthouse apartment. The bank system processed the commands instantly. A green confirmation checkmark appeared on my screen. The financial life support I had provided for 3 years evaporated into thin air. Trevor was now standing in a room full of millionaires with zero assets, massive debt, and a canceled credit card currently in the hands of a waiting bartender. I locked my phone screen and slid it back into my pocket. I poured myself a glass of cheap table water. I sat back and waited for the implosion to begin. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes echoed through the grand ballroom. A live jazz band played a smooth melody in the corner, blending with the low hum of expensive conversations. I remained seated at my assigned table, a wobbly piece of furniture shoved unceremoniously between the swinging kitchen doors and a busing station. Waiters rushed past me with heavy silver trays loaded with caviar and roasted meats. They treated me like a shadow, invisible and entirely irrelevant to the glittering spectacle unfolding across the room. I took a sip of my tap water and watched the celebration from the outside. Trevor strutted between the linen-draped tables like a conquering general inspecting his troops. He held a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and rested the other on my daughter's waist. Natalie smiled beautifully for the photographers. She wore a custom designer gown that looked like spun glass, completely absorbing the admiration of the wealthy crowd. Yet her smile lacked the genuine warmth I remembered from her childhood. She was playing a meticulously rehearsed part. She had traded her authenticity for a place in a world built on hollow prestige. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors of the main entrance swung open. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Douglas Wright stepped into the warm light of the chandeliers. The CEO of Vanguard Horizon commanded immediate attention without uttering a single word. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and carried an air of absolute, unquestionable authority. I watched Trevor abandon my daughter in an instant. His blind ambition completely eclipsed his affection for his new bride. He practically sprinted across the polished marble floor to intercept his boss. Trevor plastered on a sycophantic, desperate smile, gesturing wildly as he welcomed Douglas to the wedding reception. He wanted a promotion to vice president, and he clearly viewed this night as his ultimate networking opportunity. Trevor guided Douglas through the sea of guests. He introduced the CEO to local politicians, wealthy investors, and minor celebrities. He made absolutely sure everyone in the room saw him walking shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful man in the financial district. Eventually, their path led them away from the center of the room. They moved steadily toward the poorly lit corner where I sat alone. Trevor could have walked past me. He could have ignored my existence completely and continued his tour of the elite. But arrogance is a relentless disease that constantly demands an audience. He stopped right in front of my small table. He deliberately forced the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar firm to look down at a man wearing a frayed, outdated suit. Trevor pointed his expensive champagne flute directly at me. His voice carried over the jazz music loud and intentionally projected so the neighboring tables could hear every single syllable. He told Douglas that I was his new father-in-law. He did not stop there. A cruel, condescending laugh escaped his lips. He introduced me as an unemployed loser who had spent his entire life achieving absolutely nothing. He boldly claimed that he was forced to step up and generously support me out of the goodness of his heart. He painted himself as a wealthy savior, rescuing a pathetic, helpless old man from a life on the streets. The music seemed to fade into a dull buzz. A heavy, suffocating silence spread rapidly through our section of the ballroom. Hundreds of scornful eyes turned toward my lonely table. Wealthy guests whispered behind their manicured hands. They looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and outright disgust. I shifted my gaze away from Trevor and looked at Natalie. She stood just a few yards away, near a massive ice sculpture. She heard every single word her husband said. I waited for the daughter I raised to speak up. I waited for her to defend the man who had sacrificed his entire life to secure her future. She lowered her head. She stared intensely at the marble floor, completely paralyzed by the fear of losing her fabricated social status. She refused to meet my eyes. Her silence was a final, undeniable confirmation of her betrayal. She chose the illusion of wealth over the father who had loved her unconditionally. I did not yell. I did not throw my glass or demand basic respect. Anger is a weapon for the weak, and I had long ago learned to master my emotions. I slowly pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor, cutting through the tense quiet of the room. I stood up to my full height. I reached down and calmly buttoned my worn suit jacket. I bypassed Trevor entirely. I looked directly into the eyes of Douglas Wright. Our eyes met, and the bustling ballroom vanished from my mind. 20 years ago, I sat across from a terrified young man in a cramped, windowless office. Douglas had been on the verge of total bankruptcy. He was drowning in debt and completely abandoned by his business partners. I saw a spark of raw, unpolished brilliance in him that day. I paid off his aggressive creditors. I pulled him from the wreckage of his failure and personally placed him in the executive chair of Vanguard Horizon. I built the financial empire from the shadows, letting him be the public face while I guided his every major decision. I trusted him with my legacy. Trevor extended his hand toward his boss, expecting a hearty handshake and a shared laugh at my expense. Douglas did not move. He did not blink. The blood drained completely from the CEO's face, leaving him as pale as a ghost. His eyes locked onto mine, recognizing the man who held the absolute power to dismantle the entire room and everyone in it. Douglas ignored Trevor's outstretched hand entirely. He took a deliberate step forward, planting his feet firmly on the marble floor. Then, the most powerful executive in the city bowed deeply from the waist. He bent his head before the man in the frayed suit. When he straightened up, his voice cut through the dead silent ballroom like a sharp crack of thunder. He looked directly at me, completely ignoring the groom standing beside him. "Good evening, Mr. Chairman," Douglas said. The two words hung in the stagnant air of the ballroom. "Mr. Chairman?" The jazz band had abruptly stopped playing, leaving a profound, suffocating silence in their wake. Douglas Wright remained bowed before me, his posture radiating absolute respect and subservience. Beside him, Trevor stood frozen, his outstretched hand perfectly manicured and eager for a career. Defining handshake remained suspended in the empty space between them. I watched the arrogant smirk melt off his face. It was replaced by a rapid, frantic blinking, as if his brain was desperately trying to reboot and process a reality that completely defied his comprehension. The surrounding guests, the very elite he had tried so hard to impress just moments ago, stared at us with wide, terrified eyes. The whispers died instantly. The clinking of glasses ceased. The entire room was paralyzed by the sudden shift in power. Trevor let out a nervous, breathless chuckle. He lowered his hand and wiped his sweating palm against the expensive fabric of his custom trousers. He stepped toward Douglas, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of the moment. He told his chief executive officer that there must be some kind of hilarious misunderstanding. He gestured toward me, pointing a trembling finger at my faded, outdated suit. He reminded Douglas that I was just Natalie's father, a retired broke carpenter who did not even belong in a venue of this caliber. He begged Douglas to stop making jokes at his expense. Douglas slowly straightened his posture. He turned his head slowly, locking his piercing gaze onto his junior project manager. The look in the CEO's eyes contained zero warmth, zero amusement, and absolutely zero mercy. Douglas did not raise his voice. He did not need to. True authority does not shout. He spoke in a cold, measured tone that carried clearly across the polished marble floor. He informed Trevor that there was no misunderstanding. He then turned his attention to the crowd, his voice echoing through the grand hall. He formally introduced me to the hundreds of stunned guests. He declared that I, Anthony Shaw, was not an unemployed burden. He announced that I was the founding partner, the majority shareholder, and the anonymous chairman of Vanguard Horizon. The color drained entirely from Trevor's face. His jaw went slack. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The man he had just shoved into a filthy service hallway, the man he had publicly humiliated and labeled a pathetic loser, was the absolute sovereign of the financial empire that paid his salary. The wealth Trevor worshipped, the corporate ladder he was so desperate to climb, the very foundation of his arrogant existence, was entirely owned by me. He stumbled backward, his shiny leather shoes slipping slightly on the slick floor. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a primal, desperate terror. Douglas took a step toward him. He crossed his arms behind his back, looking down at Trevor, as if he were observing a stain on the carpet. Douglas stated that Vanguard Horizon was built on a foundation of integrity, respect, and immaculate judgment. He told Trevor that his behavior tonight was a grotesque violation of those core principles. He systematically dismantled the groom's entire professional identity in front of his peers, his friends, and his new bride. Douglas said that a man who would treat his own family with such brazen cruelty and staggering disrespect could never be trusted to manage the firm's assets. He could not be trusted to lead a team, and he certainly could not be trusted to represent the Vanguard name. Trevor opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Douglas delivered the final fatal blow without a single ounce of hesitation. He looked Trevor directly in the eyes and fired him. He terminated his employment effective immediately. He ordered him to surrender his corporate credentials and clear out his desk under the supervision of security by Monday morning. A sharp, piercing sound shattered the heavy silence. A crystal champagne flute slipped from Natalie's trembling fingers and crashed against the marble floor. The glass exploded into 100 glittering pieces, scattering across the ground like the remnants of her fabricated fairy tale. I shifted my gaze to my daughter. Her hands were pressed tightly over her mouth. Her eyes darted back and forth between me and her ruined husband. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving under the expensive silk of her designer gown. The illusion of high society she had sold her soul to protect had just collapsed around her ankles. Trevor fell to his knees. The sharp edges of the broken crystal crunched beneath the fabric of his trousers, but he did not seem to feel the physical pain. He was entirely consumed by the destruction of his ego. He clasped his hands together and looked up at me. He begged for his job. He pleaded for a second chance. He swore that he was just stressed about the wedding, that he had drank too much, that he had made a terrible, uncharacteristic mistake. He called me Dad, his voice dripping with a sickening, desperate sycophancy. He asked me to forgive him, to tell Douglas to reverse the decision, to save his career. I looked down at the pathetic man kneeling in the shards of broken glass. I did not say a single word. I did not yell, curse, or demand an apology. My decades of navigating the ruthless, bloodthirsty landscape of corporate acquisitions had taught me a profound lesson. The most devastating punishment you can inflict on an arrogant person is not a screaming match. It is not a violent physical altercation. The ultimate execution is absolute silence, while you systematically strip away every ounce of power they possess. You do not argue with a parasite. You simply cut off its life support and watch it wither away. My silence pressed down on Trevor like a physical weight. It suffocated his excuses. It amplified his humiliation. He looked into my eyes, searching for a trace of the weak, submissive carpenter he thought he had cornered. He found nothing but an impenetrable, freezing void. He finally understood that there would be no debate, no negotiation, and absolutely no mercy. He had dug his own grave with his arrogance, and I was simply letting him lie in it. I slowly reached up and adjusted the collar of my faded suit jacket. I turned my back on the groom. I did not spare another glance for Natalie. Her tears of panic were born out of financial terror, not genuine remorse. She had chosen her path the moment she turned her head away and let her husband banish me to the kitchen. I began to walk toward the main exit. The crowd of wealthy elites, the same people who had snickered and whispered about me just 10 minutes earlier, immediately parted. They cleared a wide path to the grand double doors, lowering their eyes as I passed. They shrank back, terrified of drawing the attention of a man who could destroy a career with a single silent nod. The jazz band remained completely still. The only sound in the vast hall was the steady rhythmic click of my worn leather shoes against the marble, accompanied by Trevor's muffled, pathetic sobbing in the background. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out of the suffocating ballroom. The cold, crisp night air hit my face, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. The parking lot was empty and quiet, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. I took a deep, steadying breath. The initial phase of the correction was complete, but the root of the infection remained. Natalie's betrayal required an immediate structural response. She needed to understand the true cost of the toxic vanity she had embraced. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed a highly encrypted private number. The line rang exactly twice before a sharp, alert voice answered on the other end. I bypassed all pleasantries. I gave Stephen Blake a direct, unyielding command. I ordered my lawyer to execute a complete and total freeze on all the hidden trust funds, investment portfolios, and emergency accounts established in Natalie's name. I instructed him to block her access to the primary estate funds and cancel the platinum credit cards she believed were tied to her own modest savings. I ended the call before Stephen could ask a single question. I slid the phone back into my pocket, knowing that by sunrise the real nightmare for the newlyweds would officially begin. I sat in the driver's seat of my old truck, parked at the far edge of the lot. Through the massive glass windows of the venue, the glittering reception looked like a silent movie playing out its final tragic scene. The jazz band had resumed playing, attempting to cover the awkward tension Douglas had left behind, but the damage was irreversible. I watched the restaurant manager approach the master bar. He was a tall, severe-looking man carrying a thick leather portfolio. It contained the final bill for the evening. Trevor stood there with his posture rigid. He was desperately trying to project an air of control after his public humiliation. He pulled a sleek black card from his wallet and dropped it onto the silver tray with an arrogant flick of his wrist. I knew exactly what was about to happen. The bartender swiped the card. The machine beeped a flat rejection. Trevor frowned, snatched the card back, and handed over another. The machine rejected it again. A third card followed with the exact same result. Even from a distance, the absolute panic on Trevor's face was unmistakable. His jaw tightened. He argued with the bartender, pointing aggressively at the terminal. He blamed their system, he blamed the bank, and he blamed everything except his own empty pockets. The manager stepped forward. His professional smile was entirely replaced by a hard line of impatience. The total bill for the custom ice sculptures, the vintage champagne, and the imported floral arrangements was staggering. It was a sum Trevor had confidently promised to pay, relying entirely on the secret financial safety net I had just permanently destroyed. The realization that he was stranded with no funds began to suffocate him. He grabbed Natalie by the wrist. He pulled her away from a group of whispering bridesmaids, completely ignoring her startled protests. He dragged her down the hall toward the private bridal suite and slammed the heavy wooden door behind them. I sat in the quiet cab of my truck and waited. I placed my phone on the dashboard. 2 minutes later, the screen lit up. Natalie was calling. The vibration hummed against the hard plastic. I stared at her name glowing in the dark. A part of me, the father who used to carry her on his shoulders, wanted to answer. I wanted to hear her voice ask if she was safe and fix the mess she was in. But true love requires strict boundaries. If I answered, if I transferred the funds and bailed them out, I would only be funding her continued delusion. I remembered the early days of building Vanguard Horizon. I remembered sitting in a freezing, unheated apartment, chewing on stale bread, and drinking tap water for 3 consecutive years. I sacrificed every comfort to build a foundation of absolute financial security. I learned during those brutal, starving years that extreme pressure is the only mechanism that forces a human being to reveal their true character. When a man is backed into a corner with nothing left to lose, you finally see the monster hiding beneath the tailored suit. I reached forward, pressed the red button, and rejected the call. The screen went black. I pictured the scene inside that bridal suite. I could envision Trevor pacing the room like a caged animal. I knew he was screaming at my daughter, demanding to know why the pathetic old carpenter was not picking up the phone. His entire facade of wealth and superiority had vanished. He was reduced to a desperate debtor hiding from a restaurant manager. My phone lit up again. It was another call from Natalie. I rejected it instantly. Then came a text message. It was frantic, begging me to answer, claiming there was a massive billing error and they needed an emergency loan just for the night. The manipulation was sickening. She was still protecting him. She was still trying to maintain the lie. Inside the venue, time was running out. Through the glass, I saw the manager speaking to a pair of uniformed security guards. They were moving deliberately toward the bridal suite. The threat of police involvement was no longer a vague possibility. It was imminent. Defrauding a business of tens of thousands of dollars carried severe criminal charges. Trevor was out of options. His credit was gone. His job was gone. His secret benefactor had vanished. In that moment of absolute desperation, he made the fatal decision to cross the line from arrogance into outright felony. He reached into his leather briefcase. He bypassed his useless credit cards and pulled out a folded, heavily notarized legal document. It was a comprehensive financial power of attorney. He had secretly prepared it months ago, forging my signature with the intention of seizing my modest home and meager savings. He believed I was a senile fool. He believed this piece of paper would grant him access to whatever small retirement fund I possessed to pay his immediate debts. He gripped the forged document tightly and stepped out of the suite to face the manager, completely unaware that he was about to present a fake authorization to access the accounts of a billionaire. The morning sun filtered through the dusty window panes of my cabin, casting long, sharp shadows across the wooden floorboards. I sat at my small kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee. The silence of the surrounding woods usually brought me immense peace, a quiet sanctuary away from the brutal, high-stakes world of corporate finance I secretly controlled. But today the silence felt heavy. It felt like the suffocating, tense air right before a hurricane makes landfall. I knew they were coming. Desperation makes arrogant men incredibly predictable, and Trevor Evans was currently the most desperate man in the city. The harsh crunch of gravel in the driveway shattered the morning quiet. A car door slammed with aggressive, violent force. Heavy, rapid footsteps pounded up the wooden steps of my front porch. They did not bother to knock. The front door burst open, hitting the interior wall with a loud thud that rattled the picture frames. Trevor marched into my home. The immaculate, custom-tailored wedding tuxedo from the night before was gone, replaced by wrinkled designer casual wear that smelled of stale sweat and panic. His eyes were bloodshot, frantic, and feral. Natalie trailed closely behind him. Her face was pale, completely devoid of the radiant bridal glow she had paraded around the ballroom. It was replaced by a tight mask of calculated manipulation. They invaded my sanctuary without a single shred of hesitation or basic human respect. I did not stand up. I did not show an ounce of intimidation. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark coffee and waited for the pathetic performance to begin. Trevor did not waste his breath on pleasantries. He paced across the center of my living room, his expensive leather shoes scuffing the worn hand-woven rug. He slammed a thick stack of legal documents down on my kitchen table, the heavy thud echoing in the small room. He pushed the papers right next to my coffee mug. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, "Deed of Trust and Mortgage Agreement." Trevor stood over me, trying to use his height to project a dominance he absolutely did not possess. He ordered me to sign the document immediately. He spoke fast, his words stumbling over each other. He claimed the restaurant manager was currently at the police station, threatening to press felony fraud charges by noon if the outstanding wedding balance was not settled in full. He needed $300,000 in liquid cash right now, and he demanded I leverage my only visible property to save his miserable reputation. I looked down at the predatory legal papers, then slowly looked up at my daughter. Natalie stepped forward, taking her cue. She deployed the exact same tearful expression she used when she was a little girl trying to escape punishment. She fell to her knees right beside my wooden chair. She reached out and grabbed my rough, calloused hands, squeezing them tight. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The display was perfectly timed and flawlessly executed. She begged me to help them. She claimed that Trevor was simply under a massive amount of stress yesterday. She looked me directly in the eyes and lied with terrifying ease. She said his cruel, degrading words at the reception, calling me a worthless loser in front of a billionaire and banishing me to the service kitchen, were just a terrible, drunken mistake. She promised that if I just signed the house over to the bank, things would go back to normal. She promised they would take care of me in my old age. She spun a web of toxic deceit right inside my home. I stared deeply into my daughter's eyes. I searched desperately for a trace of the kind, honest girl I had spent my entire life raising. I searched for the child who used to help me sand wooden chairs in the garage. I found absolutely nothing. Her tears were entirely manufactured. Her excuses for her husband's monstrous behavior were pathetic and vile. She was completely willing to sacrifice my shelter, my safety, to protect the fragile ego of a bankrupt narcissist. She wanted me to mortgage the cabin. She wanted me to hand over the very walls that held the echoes of my entire existence. I built this cabin piece by piece when I was a young, struggling carpenter. Every wooden beam, every nail, every floorboard was placed by my own hands. This was the exact room where my late wife, Sarah, spent her final days. This was the floor where I held her hand as cancer slowly and mercilessly stole the breath from her lungs. Before she died, she made me swear a vow. She made me promise to keep our home safe, to preserve the modest, grounded life we had built together far away from the corrupting, soulless influence of extreme wealth. She warned me that money could rot a person's soul from the inside out. I had spent 2 full decades hiding my massive financial empire just to honor that sacred promise. I lived like a poor man to protect Natalie from the very greed that was now consuming her. Now the child Sarah brought into this world was kneeling on that same sacred floor, using her mother's memory as a cheap bargaining chip to finance a mountain of fraudulent debt. Natalie was not asking for a temporary loan. She was demanding that I desecrate her mother's legacy so her husband could keep driving a luxury sports car and pretending to be a titan of industry. The heavy grief inside my chest hardened into cold, absolute, unbreakable resolve. I pulled my hands out of Natalie's grasp. I reached out and picked up the thick stack of mortgage documents from the table. Trevor stopped his frantic pacing. A greedy, victorious smirk began to stretch across his face. He actually believed he had won. He actually believed his bullying had broken my spirit. He reached into his designer pocket and pulled out an expensive silver pen. He held it out for me, eager for me to sign away my life and hand him my salvation. I did not take the silver pen. I grasped the thick stack of legal papers firmly in both of my calloused hands. I looked Trevor dead in the eyes, ensuring he saw the absolute zero of my mercy. I ripped the entire stack of documents straight down the middle. The sharp, violent sound of tearing paper echoed loudly in the small kitchen. Natalie gasped loudly and scrambled backward, her hands flying to her mouth. Trevor's triumphant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. I stacked the torn halves together and ripped them again, reducing his financial lifeline to useless confetti. I let the shredded pieces flutter down onto the floor, scattering them completely over my worn work boots. I told them with total chilling calm that I would never give them a single dime. I told them this house was built on honesty, sweat, and genuine love, and I would gladly burn it to the ground myself before I let a parasite use it to pay off his fraudulent, pathetic lifestyle. Trevor snapped. The thin veneer of civilization completely evaporated, revealing the violent coward underneath. He lunged across the small kitchen table. His hands shot forward and grabbed the collar of my faded flannel shirt. He yanked me upward, hauling me out of my chair with violent, trembling force. His face was inches from mine. I could smell the stale alcohol and sour, bitter desperation on his breath. Natalie screamed his name, but she made absolutely no physical move to stop him. She simply stood back and watched her husband physically assault her elderly father. Trevor shook me, his knuckles digging painfully into my collarbone. His eyes were wide with a dangerous, cornered madness. He snarled through gritted teeth, his spit hitting my cheek. He told me that I was a stupid, stubborn, useless old fool. He told me that he had tried to do this the easy way, that he had tried to be nice. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a lethal, venomous whisper. He declared that since I refused to cooperate, since I refused to hand over the house, he was going to use his final card. He promised me that by the end of the week I would be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing. He swore he would take the house, the land, and every penny to my name, whether I signed for it or not. He shoved me violently backward into the wooden chair. He spun around, grabbed Natalie by the arm, and stormed out of the cabin. The heavy front door slammed shut behind them, rattling the window frames and echoing through the quiet woods. I sat in the chair, smoothed my wrinkled collar, and calmly picked up my coffee cup. He thought he was holding a winning hand. He truly believed his forged documents gave him the ultimate power. He did not know that his final card was about to trigger an avalanche that would bury him alive. The heavy oak door had barely settled into its frame before my encrypted secure line began to ring. It was a harsh, jarring sound that pierced the lingering tension in the cabin. I swept the torn pieces of the mortgage document off my boots and walked over to my desk. Stephen Blake never called me on this specific line unless the foundation of our enterprise was under direct attack. I picked up the receiver. Stephen did not waste time with formal greetings. His voice was a tight coil of urgency. He informed me that Trevor had just crossed the line from petty financial desperation into a full-scale, coordinated legal assault. While Trevor had been screaming in my kitchen and threatening to throw me out on the street, his lawyers had been quietly filing an emergency petition in the family court of the city. Stephen had intercepted the filing through a court clerk he kept on retainer. Trevor was petitioning for immediate involuntary legal guardianship over me. He had attached a comprehensive, meticulously forged medical dossier claiming I was suffering from advanced, rapid-onset senile dementia. The fraudulent documents painted a picture of a delusional, incapacitated old man who was a physical danger to himself and utterly incapable of managing his own financial affairs. Trevor was legally requesting total, unchecked control over my physical person and every single asset attached to my name. I stood perfectly still by the window watching the dust settle in the driveway where Trevor had sped away. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was almost impressive. It was the frantic, desperate gamble of a man who knew he was drowning. Trevor had realized his extortion attempt at the bank would fail if I simply refused to authorize the transfer. He needed a legal mechanism to bypass my consent entirely. If a judge granted him temporary emergency guardianship, Trevor would gain instant access to my public accounts, my property deeds, and my health directives. He could sell the cabin, liquidate my visible savings, and forcibly commit me to a psychiatric facility while he scoured my records for the rest of my hidden wealth. He was planning to erase my legal existence. Stephen asked me if I wanted to dispatch a private security team to the cabin to physically block Trevor from returning. He offered to immediately file a counter-injunction and have Trevor arrested for submitting fraudulent medical records to a federal judge. I listened to my lawyer outline the aggressive defense strategy. Then I told him to do absolutely nothing of the sort. Panic is a visceral reaction reserved for prey. I was not prey. The physical weakness in my chest was a verified medical reality. My heart failure was a documented condition that required strict daily medication and careful management. I lived with the constant, quiet rhythm of a failing heart. But the physical decay of my body had absolutely no bearing on the razor-sharp precision of my mind. My intellect had always been my most lethal weapon. It was the exact same weapon I had used decades ago to dismantle ruthless corporate raiders and outmaneuver the most vicious predators on Wall Street. I had crushed billion-dollar syndicates, not by matching their loud aggression, but by allowing them to overextend their reach until they stumbled into their own carefully laid traps. Trevor was attempting to play a high-stakes game of chess, completely unaware that I owned the board. I gave Stephen a new set of instructions. I ordered him to quietly assemble the most formidable independent medical board in the state. I required 3 top-tier board-certified psychiatrists and a leading neurologist to arrive at my cabin through the back logging road within the next 2 hours. They needed to conduct a completely unassailable, legally binding evaluation of my cognitive faculties. Secondly, I instructed Stephen to bring his most discreet technical surveillance team. If Trevor wanted to build a narrative of my mental decline, I was going to provide him with the perfect stage, and I was going to broadcast his performance directly to the authorities. The transformation of my quiet sanctuary began exactly 45 minutes later. 2 unmarked black vans arrived at the rear edge of my property, hidden entirely by the thick pine trees. Stephen stepped into the kitchen, accompanied by 4 technicians dressed in nondescript clothing. They moved with absolute silent efficiency. Within 30 minutes, high-definition micro-cameras and sensitive audio recorders were seamlessly integrated into the rustic environment of my home. They were embedded inside the smoke detectors tucked behind the antique bookshelf and hidden within the wooden trim of the kitchen cabinets. Every square inch of the living room and kitchen was now under total, undeniable surveillance. Immediately following the technicians, the medical board arrived. 3 distinguished doctors entered my living room, carrying heavy briefcases filled with cognitive assessment protocols. For the next 3 hours, I sat at my wooden dining table and underwent the most rigorous mental scrutiny imaginable. They tested my short-term recall, my long-term memory retention, my spatial awareness, and my complex problem-solving capabilities. I answered every single question with absolute clarity. I calculated compound interest formulas in my head. I recounted specific details of federal tax law and detailed the architectural schematics of the cabin I had built with my own hands. When the evaluation concluded, the lead psychiatrist, a stern woman with decades of clinical experience, closed her portfolio. She looked at Stephen and stated for the official record that I possessed a level of cognitive acuity that surpassed most men half my age. She signed a sworn, legally binding affidavit certifying my complete and total mental competence. The other doctors followed suit, creating an impenetrable fortress of medical evidence that completely nullified Trevor's fraudulent court filing. Stephen secured the documents in his briefcase. We had the ultimate shield. Now it was time to let the enemy walk blindly into the fire. I instructed Stephen and the medical team to leave immediately through the back exit. I needed the cabin to appear completely isolated and vulnerable. I sat back down in the same wooden chair where I had eaten breakfast. I placed a fresh cup of coffee on the table and waited as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the floorboards. The quiet rhythm of the forest returned, but it was a deceptive peace. The familiar crunch of tires on the gravel driveway broke the silence. The surveillance monitors discreetly positioned inside my desk drawer flickered to life. Trevor had returned, but he had not come back to argue. He had not brought Natalie to cry and plead for money. Through the hidden camera feed, I watched him step out of his vehicle accompanied by a man I had never seen before. The stranger carried a worn leather medical bag. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit and had the nervous, shifting eyes of a career criminal. This was the fraudulent doctor Trevor had hired to validate his court petition. They walked up the porch steps together. I watched Trevor retrieve a small clear vial from his pocket and hand it to the fake physician. The liquid inside was a heavy industrial-grade sedative, a powerful chemical cocktail designed to induce severe hallucinations, slurred speech, and total loss of motor control. Trevor was not just planning to steal my assets. He intended to forcefully drug me, record my chemically induced breakdown on his phone, and submit the video to the judge as irrefutable proof of my violent dementia. He wanted to destroy my mind to steal my wealth. The front doorknob began to turn. I remained seated at the kitchen table, keeping my breathing perfectly slow and steady. I watched the door swing open. Trevor stepped into the room wearing a sickening, triumphant smile, completely unaware that he had just crossed the threshold into a prison of his own making. The fake doctor stepped further into my living room, carrying a cheap plastic medical case that looked like it had been bought at a discount pharmacy. He was a man with nervous, shifting eyes and an ill-fitting suit radiating the unmistakable energy of a career criminal desperately trying to play a professional. Trevor stood directly behind him, his posture stiff with a sickening mixture of triumph and false concern. In his right hand, Trevor carried a tall glass of freshly poured orange juice. The color was slightly off, tainted by whatever heavy chemical cocktail they had mixed into it, just moments before, on my front porch. Natalie hovered near the doorway, holding her smartphone up, with the camera lens pointed squarely at my face. Trevor had clearly manipulated her into believing this entire charade was an act of profound love. He had convinced my daughter that this was a necessary medical intervention to save her rapidly deteriorating father. He wanted high-definition video evidence of my non-compliance, or better yet, my drug-induced collapse, to present to a judge. The imposter cleared his throat and introduced himself using a fabricated title from a non-existent clinic. He spoke with a condescending, overly gentle tone, the specific cadence reserved for speaking to toddlers or the deeply confused. He claimed he was there to administer a basic cognitive supplement, a mild liquid vitamin designed to help clear my mental fog and stabilize my heart rate. Trevor stepped forward and placed the clouded glass of juice on the wooden table right in front of me. He looked directly at Natalie's camera, putting on a masterful Oscar-worthy performance of filial piety. He begged me to drink it. He told Natalie that they were doing this because they loved me, because my mind was slipping away, and because I needed to be medicated for my own safety. He then stood directly between me and the front exit, planting his feet firmly, using his body to block any physical chance of escape. I stared down at the glass. I did not see a refreshing morning beverage. I saw a lethal weapon designed to strip away my autonomy. Trevor thought he was being incredibly clever. He believed he was executing a flawless cinematic betrayal against a helpless old carpenter. He did not realize that I had survived for decades in the absolute darkest, most cutthroat corners of the financial underworld. Long before Vanguard Horizon became a sanitized, legitimate titan of industry, I swam in shark-infested waters. I had dealt with ruthless corporate raiders who would smile, warmly shake your hand, and slide a poison pill contract across the boardroom table. I learned early on that the most dangerous predators in the world do not carry guns in dark alleys. They carry leather briefcases, fake smiles, and seemingly innocent offers in brightly lit rooms. Surviving that brutal corporate warfare required hypervigilance. It required the rare ability to anticipate a trap and redirect the enemy's momentum entirely against them. I had spent 20 years mastering the delicate art of psychological misdirection. Trevor was a rank amateur playing a deadly game with a seasoned grandmaster. I knew I could not simply refuse to drink the juice. If I refused, Trevor would use the video footage to prove my paranoia and hostility to the family court. He would instantly escalate to physical force, relying on the fake doctor to restrain me while Natalie captured the violent struggle on her phone. I needed to neutralize the immediate chemical threat while maintaining my flawless facade of absolute vulnerability. I looked up at Trevor. I deliberately let my hands tremble perfectly, mimicking the uncontrollable tremors of a terrified, confused senior citizen. I reached for the glass of spiked juice with both of my shaking hands. I brought the rim close to my lips, letting Trevor's triumphant, greedy grin widen. Then I executed the maneuver. With a sharp, deliberate jerk of my right elbow, I knocked the heavy crystal glass forcefully against the solid edge of the wooden dining table. The glass tipped over violently, spilling a small wave of the clouded orange juice directly onto the antique woven rug beneath us. I let out a loud, startled gasp, apologizing profusely, and acting utterly mortified by my own clumsiness. I dropped to my knees, frantically grabbing a cloth napkin from the table to scrub at the spreading wet stain. The sudden, chaotic movement shattered the sterile, highly controlled environment Trevor had carefully orchestrated. Natalie instinctively lowered her phone, completely distracted by the sudden mess. The fake doctor stepped back quickly, trying to avoid getting his cheap leather shoes stained. Trevor let out a sharp hiss of profound irritation, his carefully crafted mask of a loving son-in-law slipping for a fraction of a second. He leaned over the table to grab the rolling glass, completely annoyed by the interruption to his perfect plan. In that precise window of utter distraction, I moved with the practiced invisible speed of a street magician. Beside the spilled glass rested a second identical crystal glass filled with fresh, untainted orange juice I had poured for myself earlier that morning. I seamlessly slid the spiked glass toward Trevor's side of the table and pulled the clean glass directly in front of me. The rapid movement was entirely masked by the frantic motion of my other arm vigorously scrubbing the rug. I stood up, breathing heavily, playing the role of an exhausted, embarrassed old man. I picked up the clean glass of juice. I looked at Natalie, giving her a weak, apologetic smile, and drank the entire glass in one continuous, uninterrupted motion. Trevor exhaled a heavy, dramatic sigh of relief. He honestly believed his chemical weapon had just been successfully deployed. He patted my shoulder with rough, patronizing affection, entirely dropping the loving act now that the deed was done. He turned to the fake doctor and nodded confidently, signaling that the first phase of their hostile takeover was officially complete. The adrenaline was pumping so fiercely through Trevor's veins that he reached down and grabbed the other glass of juice resting on the table. He was parched from his own nervous energy and the sheer intoxicating thrill of his perceived victory. Without a single rational thought, completely blinded by his own towering arrogance, Trevor lifted the spiked glass to his lips and swallowed the remaining clouded liquid. He eagerly drank his own poison. I sat back down in my wooden chair and folded my hands neatly on my lap. The fake doctor began pulling useless generic medical forms from his bag, pretending to take clinical notes on my physical condition. Natalie stepped back out into the hallway, raising her phone again, waiting for the dramatic, tragic breakdown her husband had promised her. I simply watched the vintage clock ticking on the wall. I knew the precise chemical nature of industrial sedatives used in these kinds of illicit operations. I knew exactly how long it took for the synthetic compounds to breach the blood-brain barrier and completely rewire the nervous system. The silence in the cabin stretched out tight and heavily expectant. Trevor stood near the stone fireplace, crossing his arms confidently, waiting for me to collapse. He waited for the slurred speech, the violent hallucinations, and the total loss of motor control that would forever justify his fraudulent court petition. 10 minutes passed slowly. My breathing remained perfectly steady. My posture was relaxed, and my eyes remained sharp and intensely focused. I looked directly at Trevor, my expression completely unchanged. Trevor frowned. The triumphant gleam in his eyes flickered. He checked his expensive wristwatch. He glanced nervously at the fake doctor, seeking a medical explanation for the delay. The doctor shrugged slightly, clearly confused by my continued lucidity. 15 minutes passed. The atmosphere in the living room shifted with terrifying speed. It started with a severe, uncontrollable tremor in Trevor's right hand. He reached up to wipe a sudden thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead. His pupils dilated massively, swallowing the color of his eyes until they looked like twin black holes of panic. He stumbled backward, his knees buckling underneath his expensive trousers. The heavy dose of the hallucinogenic sedative slammed into his central nervous system like a runaway freight train. He tried to speak to Natalie, but his jaw slacked uselessly. A stream of incoherent, terrifying babble spilled from his mouth. He pointed a shaking, frantic finger at the empty corner of the room, screaming at the top of his lungs about invisible shadows and crawling insects emerging from the floorboards. Natalie dropped her phone in absolute horror. She rushed forward, grabbing her husband by the shoulders, completely terrified by the sudden, violent transformation of the man she loved. Trevor shoved her away with brutal, uncoordinated force. He crashed heavily into the wooden coffee table, sending antique lamps and heavy books flying across the room. He tore off his designer jacket, clawing frantically at his own skin, howling that the walls of the cabin were closing in to crush him. He picked up a solid oak dining chair and hurled it mindlessly against the stone fireplace, shattering the furniture into jagged, dangerous splinters. The fake doctor backed away toward the front door, his face pale with absolute panic, realizing the controlled situation had completely detonated into a catastrophic emergency. I remained perfectly still in my seat. I did not lift a single finger to stop the destruction or calm my screaming daughter. I simply watched the man who had tried to erase my existence completely dismantle his own sanity. High above us, hidden perfectly within the wooden trim and the smoke detectors, the synchronized lenses of my high-definition security cameras blinked silently. They captured every single frame of Trevor's drug-induced violent rampage in glorious clarity. He wanted to document a dangerous monster to show the family court judge. He was succeeding brilliantly. He was just providing the wrong star for the movie. The shattered remnants of the solid oak chair still lay scattered across the cabin floorboards. The heavy, suffocating silence of the deep woods had finally returned. The fake doctor had sprinted out the front door and vanished into the dense tree line the exact moment Trevor began violently tearing at his own face. Natalie, sobbing hysterically and completely paralyzed by a profound terror, had somehow managed to drag her heavily sedated, hallucinating husband down the porch steps. I had watched from the kitchen window as she shoved his limp, thrashing body into the passenger seat of her car. Their taillights faded into the evening shadows, leaving behind nothing but a cloud of gravel dust and the quiet, steady hum of my hidden security servers downloading the undeniable high-definition proof of their felony. I did not bother sweeping up the broken wood or wiping the spilled juice from the antique rug. I left the destruction exactly where it was. It served as a perfect physical monument to the absolute collapse of Trevor's fabricated reality. Less than an hour later, the familiar sound of a heavy engine approached the property. Stephen Blake walked through the front door. My lead attorney did not come alone. He was accompanied by a man named Marcus, the enigmatic director of Vanguard Horizon's private corporate intelligence division. Marcus moved with the silent, predatory grace of a phantom, whose entire career was dedicated to unearthing the darkest, most heavily guarded secrets of desperate men. He carried no weapons, only a thick, unmarked black leather folder. He stepped over the splintered wood without a single word and placed the heavy folder gently onto my wooden kitchen table. Stephen stood by the window, his posture rigidly professional. He informed me that their initial background check on Trevor Evans had barely scratched the surface of the man's deception. Trevor had spent a small fortune paying corrupt accountants to bury his true financial footprint under complex layers of shell companies and completely fabricated credit profiles. But Marcus and his team of forensic analysts had spent the last 48 hours tearing down those digital walls brick by brick. They had followed the hidden money trails. What they found inside that black folder was not just the pathetic portrait of an arrogant social climber. They had uncovered a parasitic, highly dangerous predator. I moved to my small, dimly lit study at the back of the cabin. The evening shadows were already crawling up the timber walls, plunging the room into a cool gray dusk. I turned on the brass desk lamp, casting a warm, concentrated pool of light over the leather folder. I opened the heavy cover and began to read. The first document was a comprehensive master ledger of Trevor's hidden liabilities. He was not merely broke. He was entirely underwater, drowning in a toxic, suffocating ocean of high-interest debt. But these were not standard loans from legitimate financial banking institutions. The banks had recognized his fraudulent behavior and cut his credit lines years ago. I turned the page and felt the temperature in the room plummet. Trevor Evans was a degenerate, compulsive gambler. The custom-tailored Italian suits, the leased European sports cars, the lavish corporate dinners, they were all entirely funded by illegal offshore sports betting algorithms and violent underground poker syndicates. The ledger detailed a catastrophic, uncontrollable losing streak that spanned the entirety of the last 2 years. Trevor owed exactly $600,000. He did not owe this staggering sum to a polite collection agency that would simply ruin his credit score. He owed it to a violent, ruthless loan shark operation operating out of the industrial harbor district. I continued reading the transcripts of intercepted text messages and encrypted emails Marcus had extracted from Trevor's hidden servers. The absolute nauseating truth about his marriage to my daughter stared back at me in cold, digital print. Trevor had never loved Natalie. He secretly despised her vanity and her obsession with social media status, but he brilliantly recognized her desperate need for high society validation as a fatal weakness. He targeted her specifically because he had paid a corrupt paralegal to run a quiet, illegal background check on my late wife's estate. He had found the dormant structural framework of a massive trust fund. He assumed I was a wealthy, naive old widower hoarding a massive retirement fortune in the woods. The entire romance, the extravagant wedding ceremony, the rush to the altar. It was all a meticulously calculated, cold-blooded heist. He intended to gain legal control of my daughter, have me declared mentally incompetent with fake doctors, and drain my life savings to save his own kneecaps from the mobsters breathing down his neck. I sat back in my worn leather chair. The silence of the study pressed heavily against my ears. I did not feel the fiery, blinding, chaotic rage of a betrayed father. I felt a cold, absolute, terrifying clarity. During my early years navigating the bloodthirsty, completely unregulated corners of global corporate acquisitions, I learned a fundamental law of human power. Amateurs resort to physical violence. They break bones, they scream, and they act on impulse. But true absolute power does not leave a physical bruise. True power is capturing a man's financial soul. When you control a man's debt, you control his past, his present, and every single second of his miserable future. You do not need to raise your voice or lift a finger when you hold the invisible chains of his very existence. Trevor believed he was a master manipulator. He actually believed he could play a deadly game with a criminal syndicate and simultaneously outsmart an old carpenter in the woods. I looked up at Stephen and Marcus waiting quietly in the doorway. I told them that calling the police and having Trevor arrested for the attempted drugging would be a profound, unforgivable waste of leverage. Prison was far too comfortable for a parasite. Prison offered free meals, a warm bed, and an escape from his creditors. I wanted Trevor to experience the pure, unadulterated terror of total ownership. I gave Stephen a very specific, highly unconventional directive. I ordered him to contact the leader of the Harbor Syndicate immediately. Vanguard Horizon maintained vast, entirely untraceable discretionary funds, specifically reserved for corporate espionage and hostile takeovers. I instructed Stephen to purchase Trevor's entire $600,000 debt tonight. I told him to pay the mobsters a 20% premium in untraceable cryptocurrency to secure the absolute transfer of the debt portfolio within the hour. The criminal syndicate would gladly take the guaranteed risk-free profit and walk away clean. They would transfer every promissory note, every blackmail photograph, and every single piece of violent leverage they held over Trevor directly to my corporate entity. I was no longer just the embarrassed father of the bride. I was the absolute owner of Trevor Evans. Stephen did not blink. He simply nodded, pulled a secure encrypted satellite phone from his jacket, and stepped out onto the dark porch to orchestrate the acquisition. Marcus remained in the study, offering a grim, respectful nod. He fully understood the profound psychological devastation of the strategy. We were stripping Trevor of his only excuse, removing the violent threat of the mob, and replacing it with a force far more methodical, patient, and unforgiving. An hour passed in total silence. The sun completely vanished behind the dense tree line, leaving the cabin wrapped in the pitch-black blanket of the forest night. Stephen returned to the study. He placed a single encrypted metal flash drive onto the center of my desk. The financial transaction was complete. The violent syndicate had officially relinquished all claims and severed all ties. Trevor Evans legally and financially belonged to the Vanguard Trust, miles away in the cramped, damp guest bedroom of a cheap roadside motel where Natalie had taken him to hide. Trevor was likely just beginning to wake up. I knew the heavy industrial sedative would be wearing off, leaving him with a splitting, agonizing migraine and a paralyzing, suffocating sense of dread. He had failed to secure my signature on the mortgage. He had failed to drug me and capture the video evidence. And he knew with absolute certainty that his final deadline with the loan sharks had expired at sunset. He would be lying in the dark, sweating through the cheap motel sheets, staring at the door, waiting for the terrifying sound of heavy boots kicking the wood off its hinges. I picked up my secure phone. I utilized a routed encrypted network that would entirely disguise my location and caller identity. I dialed Trevor's personal cell phone number. I listened to the digital line ring in the quiet study. Once. Twice. On the third ring, a shaking, breathless, utterly terrified voice answered the call. Trevor spoke in a frantic, weeping whisper. He immediately began begging the caller for just a few more days, swearing blindly that a massive real estate payout was coming. He pleaded for his life, promising that the money was almost in his hands, begging them not to hurt his wife. He thought he was desperately begging the ruthless syndicate boss who held his life in the balance. I let his pathetic, sobbing pleas hang in the dead, freezing air of the phone connection. I waited until his breath hitched in a pure, suffocating panic. Then I spoke in a calm, flat, measured tone that carried the freezing weight of absolute authority. I told him that he no longer owed the syndicate a single penny. I told him that his debt, his life, and his entire future had been acquired in full. The line went deathly silent. I could hear the exact moment his heart stopped in his chest. I told my son-in-law that he now answered exclusively to me, and his first payment was due by sunrise. The encrypted secure phone sitting on my heavy mahogany desk vibrated with a harsh and demanding tone. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. The quiet sanctuary of my cabin was completely still, save for the steady ticking of the vintage clock on the wall. I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear. I did not hear the polished, arrogant voice of a confident financial project manager on the other end of the line. I heard the erratic, heavy breathing of a wild animal that had been backed into a dark corner with no escape. Trevor Evans had entirely lost his grip on reality. The crushing weight of a $600,000 debt owed to a violent criminal syndicate had stripped away his civilized mask. He did not bother with pleasantries or fake apologies. He bypassed any pretense of negotiation and went straight to raw extortion. He informed me that he had locked my daughter inside a cheap, soundproofed rented apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. He bragged about taking her car keys, her wallet, and her cell phone. He wanted me to picture her trapped and helpless in a filthy room. Then he dropped his final desperate card onto the table. He demanded exactly $1 million transferred to an untraceable offshore account by tomorrow morning. If I refused to pay his ransom, he promised to destroy Natalie completely. He boasted that he had placed hidden cameras in their shared bedroom over the past year. He threatened to release highly sensitive, compromising videos of my daughter to the public, to her corporate colleagues, and to her entire high society social circle. He swore he would reduce her pristine reputation to absolute ashes before the sun came up. He thought this vicious threat would break me. He thought the shame would force my hand and secure his salvation. Any normal father would have erupted into a blind, violent rage. A normal father would have shouted threats into the receiver, cursed the man on the phone, and frantically called the police to stage a dramatic rescue. I did none of those things. My heart rate did not increase. My breathing remained perfectly level and calm. During my decades of executing ruthless corporate acquisitions, I learned a profound lesson. Anger is a foolish luxury you simply cannot afford when you are staring down the barrel of a loaded weapon. You must strip every ounce of emotion from the equation and view the threat as a cold, mathematical problem. I listened to Trevor rant and rave, feeling a profound, quiet sorrow for my daughter. I loved Natalie more than my own life. When my wife passed away, I made a silent vow to protect our daughter from the darkness and cruelty of the world. I shielded her from financial hardship and provided her with every possible advantage. But protection can easily become a lethal poison. By constantly shielding her from consequence, I had allowed her vanity and superficiality to flourish unchecked. I had watched her choose a shallow, arrogant parasite over genuine human connection because he looked good in a tailored suit and promised her a life of elite status. True love is not about endless compromise. True love requires strict, painful boundaries. If I simply transferred the money and solved this problem quietly, Natalie would never learn the truth. She needed to sit in that locked apartment and experience the absolute terror of the man she had chosen. She needed to feel the bitter, agonizing sting of betrayal to finally awaken her dormant self-respect. I had to let her hit rock bottom so she could finally learn how to stand on her own 2 feet without my invisible safety net holding her up. She had to see the monster hiding behind the tuxedo. I waited patiently for Trevor to finish his hysterical shouting. His voice cracked and pitched higher as he demanded to know if I was listening to his demands. I told him I heard every single word perfectly clearly. I kept my tone entirely flat, projecting the tired resignation of a defeated old man. I informed him that transferring $1 million to an offshore account overnight was mechanically impossible for a retired carpenter living on a fixed income. I explained that any commercial bank would instantly flag a digital transfer of that magnitude and freeze the funds pending a federal investigation. I told him the money would be locked in cyberspace for weeks. Trevor began to curse loudly, pure panic bleeding through his aggressive facade. He screamed that he did not have time for standard bank protocols. He yelled that he needed the money immediately to pay off the syndicate before they found him. I let him sweat and hyperventilate for a few seconds before offering a very specific solution. I told him I had a private safety deposit box at the Central Wealth Management Bank in the downtown financial district. I lied effortlessly and told him it contained a massive sum of physical gold and untraceable bearer bonds that I had hoarded over my entire lifetime. I offered to hand over the physical assets directly to him so he could pay his debts in cash. However, I laid down an absolute non-negotiable condition. The transfer had to be done in person inside the highly secure vault of the bank. I told him he had to meet me there exactly at 9 o'clock in the morning. If he tried to send a proxy or if he harmed a single hair on Natalie's head, I would burn the bonds and let the harbor loan sharks break his legs. Trevor fell silent on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his desperate, greedy mind. The prospect of physical, untraceable wealth was an intoxicating drug to a degenerate gambler. It offered him a clean slate and an instant escape from the violent men hunting him in the shadows. His towering arrogance completely blinded him to the obvious trap being laid beneath his feet. He still viewed me as a broken, terrified old man desperately trying to save his precious daughter from public disgrace. He could not comprehend that a poor carpenter would possess the capability or the intellect to outmaneuver a corporate project manager. He let out a harsh, victorious laugh and eagerly accepted my terms. He promised to be at the bank right at opening time, warning me that he had friends monitoring Natalie just in case I tried to involve the authorities. He ended the call with a smug, self-satisfied click. I set the phone down on my mahogany desk and looked out at the dark woods outside my window. The early signs of dawn were just beginning to paint the horizon in shades of gray. Trevor believed he had successfully played his ultimate trump card. He truly believed he had backed me into an inescapable corner and secured his absolute financial salvation. He was likely already planning how to spend the excess funds once he paid off his debts and walked away a rich man. He pictured himself strutting through the polished marble lobby of the bank to collect his final prize. He had absolutely no idea that the Grand Central Bank he was driving to tomorrow morning was a primary subsidiary branch entirely owned and operated by Vanguard Horizon. He was marching confidently into the absolute center of my financial empire, convinced he was the untouchable king of the world. The morning sunlight filtered through the tinted floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vanguard Central Bank Executive Suite. The room was a masterclass in silent intimidation. It featured thick mahogany paneling, soundproof glass walls, and an atmosphere of absolute untouchable authority. I sat at the head of the massive conference table. My posture was relaxed, my breathing steady and deeply controlled. For decades, I had utilized this exact room to dismantle corrupt corporate empires and sever the lifelines of the most vicious predators on Wall Street. Today, the stakes were entirely personal, but the strategy remained identical. I was waiting for a parasite to willingly walk into a completely inescapable trap. Trevor Evans marched into the room with a forceful thrust of the heavy wooden doors. He wore a freshly pressed designer suit, clearly an attempt to project power and absolute control after the pathetic drug-induced meltdown he had suffered at my cabin just 24 hours prior. He moved with a manic, arrogant energy. He genuinely believed he held the ultimate winning hand. He believed he had successfully cornered a frightened, broken old carpenter. He did not offer a greeting. He completely ignored the bank manager, Mr. Sterling, who stood silently in the far corner of the expansive suite, holding a leather portfolio. Trevor approached the conference table and slammed a sleek black smartphone onto the polished wood. The device slid across the smooth surface and came to a halt right in front of my folded hands. He planted his palms on the edge of the table and leaned over, bringing his face dangerously close to mine. A smug, ugly smile twisted his features. He spoke in a rapid, venomous tone, declaring that my time for games had officially expired. He proudly announced that the phone contained hours of highly compromising, deeply humiliating video footage of my daughter. He swore that if I did not transfer $1 million to his offshore account within the next 5 minutes, he would broadcast those videos to every corporate contact, every socialite friend, and every news outlet Natalie had ever cared about. Trevor laughed, a harsh and grating sound that echoed off the glass walls. He mocked my faded flannel shirt and my worn leather boots. He called me a pathetic failure of a father who was about to watch his precious daughter lose everything she had ever valued. He demanded that I stop wasting his time and instruct the bank teller to execute the wire transfer immediately. He was intoxicated by his own perceived leverage, completely blinded by the desperate illusion of his impending wealth. He thought he was watching me break under the crushing weight of public shame and fatherly panic. I did not break my silence. I did not reach for the phone resting on the table. I simply kept my eyes locked onto his, allowing the freezing, impenetrable void of my gaze to settle over him. Then I offered a subtle, almost imperceptible nod toward the corner of the room. Trevor turned his head, finally acknowledging the existence of the bank manager. He snapped his fingers in the air, a gesture of supreme insulting condescension. He ordered Mr. Sterling to step forward, pull up the routing numbers, and process the $1 million transfer before he lost his temper. He threatened the manager, claiming he would have him fired for incompetence if he delayed the transaction by a single second. Mr. Sterling did not move toward the computer terminal. He did not acknowledge the black smartphone or Trevor's frantic demands. Instead, the manager stepped forward with rigid, immaculate posture. He walked directly past Trevor, completely ignoring his existence, and stopped at my side of the table. Mr. Sterling bowed his head in a gesture of profound, undeniable reverence. He opened his thick leather portfolio and began to speak in a clear, resonant voice that shattered the arrogant illusion Trevor had brought into the room. Mr. Sterling bypassed the demand for $1 million entirely. He addressed me directly, delivering the comprehensive morning financial briefing for the entire Vanguard Horizon conglomerate. He reported that our global asset acquisitions for the fiscal quarter had officially exceeded initial projections by $2.4 billion. He detailed the successful absorption of 3 competing hedge funds and the liquidation of several hostile shell companies. He then placed a thick stack of finalized disbursement documents directly in front of me, respectfully awaiting my final authorization to move billions of dollars across international markets. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Trevor stood completely paralyzed. His arrogant sneer dissolved, replaced by a mask of absolute paralyzing confusion. He looked down at the documents resting on the table. The bold, embossed letterhead of the very bank we were currently standing inside was printed at the top of every single page. Right below the staggering financial figures printed in clear black ink was my name. Anthony Shaw, the founding partner, majority shareholder, and supreme chairman of the institution. Trevor stumbled backward. His expensive leather shoes slipped on the polished floor. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pallid gray. The monumental scale of his miscalculation began to crush his chest. He looked around the opulent executive suite, then looked back at me, his eyes wide with a primal, suffocating terror. He had walked into the absolute heart of my financial empire, attempting to extort me using my own banking infrastructure. He did not know that this supreme vantage point had allowed me to observe his every move for years. My acute awareness was born from decades of navigating the filthy, deceptive underbelly of global corporate warfare. I knew how to track hidden liabilities, how to trace embezzled funds, and how to spot a predator long before they struck. I had watched Trevor construct his pathetic house of cards using stolen money and fraudulent credit lines. Every transaction, every desperate loan he took from the Harbor Syndicate to feed his gambling addiction had been thoroughly documented and analyzed by my intelligence division. I held his entire existence in the palm of my hand. My love for Natalie was profound, but my love did not equate to a foolish, blind compromise. I had deliberately allowed her to walk into this marriage to experience the raw, unfiltered consequences of choosing a partner based entirely on shallow social status and fabricated wealth. Shielding her from this pain would only have preserved her toxic vanity. I needed her to endure the bitter, agonizing sting of Trevor's betrayal so she could finally awaken her dormant self-respect. Her salvation required a brutal collision with reality. I reached forward and picked up the black smartphone Trevor had brought into the room. I held it between my fingers, letting him watch his ultimate weapon dangle in the air. Without a single word, I dropped the device directly into the heavy crystal pitcher of ice water sitting in the center of the table. The screen flickered violently, short-circuited, and died instantly. The water flooded the internal components, sinking his pathetic blackmail attempt to the bottom of the glass. Trevor opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a sentence. He tried to backtrack, to apologize, to offer some pathetic excuse for his behavior. No sound escaped his trembling lips. His breathing became shallow and erratic. He was drowning in the realization that he was utterly powerless. He possessed no leverage, no money, and absolutely no escape. I raised my right hand and made a final decisive gesture. The heavy steel doors of the VIP suite swung open instantly. Two massive, broad-shouldered security guards stepped into the room. They wore dark suits and moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of highly trained operatives. They grabbed the thick brass handles and pulled the heavy doors completely shut behind them. A loud metallic click echoed through the silent room as the magnetic deadbolts engaged, sealing the room from the outside world. Trevor spun around, staring at the locked doors. He backed up against the soundproof glass wall, his hands pressing flat against the cold surface. He looked frantically between the guards, the bank manager, and me. The terrifying truth finally settled over his broken mind. He had not walked into a bank to secure a ransom. He had arrogantly, willingly stepped inside a glass cage, and I had just erased the only exit. The heavy magnetic locks of the VIP suite engaged with a solid, echoing thud. Trevor Evans stood frozen against the soundproof glass wall, his breath leaving a faint, frantic fog on the pristine surface. The reality of his situation was crashing down upon him with the unstoppable force of a collapsing building. He looked at the thick stack of financial documents resting on the polished mahogany table. He looked at the bank manager, who was standing with his head bowed in absolute deference to me. Then he looked at my face. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his miscalculation finally severed the last remaining threads of his sanity. He had not just insulted a retired penniless carpenter. He had openly mocked, threatened, and attempted to extort the supreme chairman of the very financial empire that held the deed to his entire existence. A primal guttural sound tore its way out of Trevor's throat. It was the sound of a cornered animal realizing the trap was entirely inescapable. All of his polished corporate arrogance, his tailored suits, and his manufactured high society vocabulary instantly vanished. He was reduced to nothing but raw, blind panic. His eyes darted wildly toward the master ledger of his $600,000 syndicate debt lying open on the table. He believed that if he could just destroy the physical paper, he could somehow erase the terrifying reality of his total ruination. Trevor lunged. He pushed off the glass wall with violent force, hurling his body across the vast expanse of the conference room. His arms were outstretched, his fingers hooked into desperate claws, aiming directly for the stack of disbursement documents and the debt portfolio. He intended to tear the papers to shreds, completely blinded by the irrational belief that destroying the evidence would set him free. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle to defend myself. I simply remained seated in my leather executive chair, watching his pathetic charge with cold detachment. Before Trevor could even graze the edge of the mahogany table, the two massive security guards intercepted him. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency, born from years of elite tactical training. One guard grabbed Trevor by the shoulder of his expensive suit jacket, halting his forward momentum instantly. The other guard swept Trevor's legs out from under him. Trevor hit the polished marble floor with a sickening, heavy impact. The air was violently forced from his lungs. The guards did not hesitate. They pinned him face down against the cold stone, twisting his arms painfully behind his back. Trevor writhed and kicked, gasping for breath, his face pressed humiliatingly against the floorboards of my bank. Stephen Blake stepped forward, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble. He looked down at the writhing man with an expression of pure, clinical disgust. My lawyer opened his black briefcase and pulled out a fresh stack of legal filings. He informed Trevor that his impulsive, violent outburst was entirely unnecessary because the documents on the table were merely duplicate copies. Stephen stated in a calm, authoritative voice that the original debt acquisition papers, along with the comprehensive evidence of Trevor's financial fraud, had already been digitally securely transmitted to the federal authorities. Trevor gasped for air, turning his face to the side to look up at me. He spat out a string of desperate curses. He yelled that he would destroy me. He screamed that he would go to the press, that he would tell every judge in the city that I was a delusional, violent madman suffering from advanced dementia. He claimed he still had the medical dossier, the fake doctor's testimony, and the ultimate proof that I was unfit to manage my own empire. He clung to his fabricated narrative of my insanity as if it were a life raft in a boiling ocean. I slowly leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool surface of the table. I looked down at the pathetic creature pinned to the floor. I told him that he had completely forgotten a crucial rule of corporate warfare. When you attempt to lay a trap for a predator, you must be absolutely certain you are not walking into a larger cage. I gestured toward Stephen. Stephen reached into his briefcase and produced a sleek, high-definition tablet. He placed it on the edge of the table, angled perfectly, so Trevor could see the screen from the floor. Stephen tapped the display. The video began to play. The crisp, undeniable footage showed the interior of my rustic cabin from the previous afternoon. The hidden surveillance cameras had captured every single agonizing detail in glorious resolution. Trevor's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as he watched himself on the screen. He watched his own image stumble backward, dripping in a cold sweat, his pupils dilated from the heavy industrial sedative he had intended for me. The high-fidelity audio filled the executive suite. We listened to the recorded sound of Trevor screaming incoherently about invisible insects. We watched him violently shove his own wife out of the way. We watched him pick up a solid oak chair and brutally smash it into the stone fireplace, destroying my property in a drug-induced psychotic frenzy. I spoke quietly over the sound of his recorded destruction. I explained to Trevor that his plan to forcefully drug me and film my cognitive collapse was entirely predictable. I told him that substituting his poisoned juice was a rudimentary misdirection, a simple parlor trick executed by a man who had spent decades outmaneuvering the most ruthless financial sharks on Wall Street. I informed him that the video currently playing on the tablet was the exact same video my legal team had formally submitted to the district attorney less than an hour ago. Trevor stopped struggling. His body went completely limp against the marble floor. The realization crashed over him like a suffocating wave. His grand master plan had been completely inverted. The very medical narrative he had fabricated to declare me insane was now ironclad, irrefutable proof of his own violent instability. He had trespassed into my home, brought an illicit chemical substance across state lines, assaulted his wife, and destroyed my property. Combined with his extensive extortion attempts, his wire fraud, and his massive illegal gambling debts, he was staring down the barrel of decades in federal prison. The heavy magnetic locks on the suite doors clicked open. The sound was sharp and final. 3 uniformed police officers stepped into the room, accompanied by a plainclothes detective. They moved with grim purpose, entirely unfazed by the luxurious surroundings. Stephen Blake walked over to the detective and handed him a sealed manila envelope containing the emergency arrest warrants, the digital evidence drives, and the comprehensive financial timeline of Trevor's extortion attempt. The transition of power was seamless and absolute. The detective ordered the security guards to release their hold. The police officers hauled Trevor up from the floor. His expensive suit was torn and stained with sweat. He could barely stand on his own 2 feet. His legs shook violently, completely unable to support the weight of his ruined ego. He looked at me, his face a portrait of utter devastating defeat. He opened his mouth, perhaps to beg for mercy, perhaps to ask for a fraction of the grace he had so gleefully denied me. I simply turned my head away, looking out the massive window at the city skyline I practically owned. I had no words left for a parasite. The sharp metallic scrape of heavy steel echoed through the quiet room. The officers pulled Trevor's arms firmly behind his back. The handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists, locking tightly into place. The sound was the definitive period at the end of his arrogant existence. The officers turned him around and marched him roughly toward the heavy wooden doors. He did not fight them. He dragged his feet, his head hanging low, a broken man being led to his inevitable slaughter. The doors closed behind them, shutting out the noise and returning the executive suite to its immaculate, intimidating silence. I remained seated at the head of the mahogany table. Stephen and Marcus quietly began gathering the documents, packing away the remnants of the operation. The air in the room felt significantly lighter, completely purged of the toxic infection that had plagued my family for the past year. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the quiet rhythm of my failing heart. The tumor had been excised, but the surgical wound remained open. The profound silence was shattered by a sharp, persistent vibration against the polished wood. I opened my eyes and looked down. My secure personal phone was lighting up. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dimming morning light. It was Natalie. Her husband had just been dragged out of a luxury apartment by federal agents. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her platinum credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. The terrifying reality of her situation had finally arrived at her doorstep. She was calling in an absolute blind panic, desperately seeking the father she had so willingly abandoned just 48 hours prior. I stared at her name glowing on the screen, preparing myself to deliver the final, most painful lesson of her life. The torrential rain began just after midnight. It hammered against the thick timber roof of the cabin with a violent, rhythmic intensity. The storm outside perfectly mirrored the absolute chaos that had swallowed my family over the past 24 hours. I was sitting in the dim light of the kitchen, watching the heavy droplets stream down the window pane when the frantic pounding started at the front door. It was not a polite knock. It was a desperate, chaotic hammering, accompanied by the muffled sobbing sound of a woman entirely broken by the world. I stood up, walked across the hardwood floor, and pulled the heavy oak door open. Natalie stood on the porch, shivering violently in the freezing downpour. The pristine, untouchable image of the elite corporate socialite had been completely erased. Her expensive designer trench coat was soaked through, clinging heavily to her fragile frame. Her meticulously styled hair hung in wet, tangled strands across her pale face. Her luxury leather shoes were caked in thick, dark mud from my driveway. She looked like a drowning victim who had just been dragged from a freezing river. Without waiting for an invitation, she stumbled forward and collapsed into the entryway. She dropped to her knees on the antique rug, burying her face in her hands, and began to weep with a raw, agonizing desperation. I gently closed the door, shutting out the howling wind, and looked down at my only child. I did not rush to pick her up. I did not immediately wrap her in a warm blanket and tell her that everything was going to be all right. I simply waited. Through heavy gasping sobs, the entire miserable reality of her situation spilled out onto the floor. Trevor's arrest had triggered a catastrophic financial avalanche. The federal authorities had instantly frozen their joint banking accounts, pending a massive criminal investigation. When she tried to return to their luxury high-rise apartment to gather her things, she found the doors deadlocked. The landlord, having caught wind of the federal raid and months of unpaid rent, had legally locked them out. She had walked back down to the parking garage, only to find an empty concrete space. The aggressive leasing company had tracked the GPS on her imported sports car and repossessed it in the dead of night. She had spent the last 8 hours wandering the city in the freezing rain, watching every single one of her platinum credit cards decline at cheap motels and corner stores. Her elite friends, the same people who had eagerly drank her expensive champagne at the wedding, had completely ignored her frantic phone calls. She was entirely alone, stripped of her armor, and drowning in a sea of public humiliation. She looked up at me, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She begged me to save her. She pleaded with me to open my accounts, to write a blank check, and to pay off whatever debts Trevor had accumulated so she could simply get her life back. She promised she would manage the money better. She swore she would fix the mess if I just gave her the capital to make the immediate embarrassment disappear. She was staring at me not as a father, but as an emergency financial institution. She expected the unconditional rescue she had received her entire life. I turned away from her tear-stained face and walked quietly into the kitchen. I filled the copper kettle with fresh water and placed it on the stove. I methodically retrieved a ceramic teacup from the cabinet and dropped a soothing chamomile blend into the porcelain bowl. As I waited for the water to boil, I stared blindly at the blue flames of the gas burner. My chest ached with a profound, suffocating paternal grief. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to write the check to buy her a new apartment, to erase her pain instantly. But I remembered a freezing winter in Chicago exactly 40 years ago. I was a desperate, starving young man standing in the dusty workshop of an old master carpenter. I had begged him for a simple cash loan to pay my overdue rent. I was terrified of being thrown out onto the street. The old master did not give me a single dollar. Instead, he handed me a heavy, worn set of chisels and a massive block of raw, unshaped oak. He told me that giving me money would only feed my immediate panic, but teaching me how to shape the wood would feed me for the rest of my life. He forced me to work through my blistering blisters, my exhaustion, and my bitter resentment. By refusing to rescue me, he forced me to rescue myself. He taught me the brutal, beautiful reality of survival. If he had handed me that cash, I would have remained a helpless beggar forever. The kettle whistled sharply, pulling me back to the present. I poured the boiling water into the cup and carried the steaming tea into the living room. I placed it gently on the coffee table in front of Natalie. Then I walked into my study and retrieved the thick black folder Marcus had given me. I brought it out and dropped it onto the table right beside her warm drink. I told Natalie to drink the tea to warm her bones. Then I instructed her to open the folder. She hesitated, her hands trembling violently, but the absolute cold authority in my voice compelled her to obey. She flipped open the heavy leather cover. I did not spare her feelings. I walked her through every single document, with the clinical precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. I showed her the master ledger of Trevor's $600,000 gambling debt. I watched her eyes widen in shock as she read the names of the violent syndicate members he owed. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. I reached into the folder and pulled out the encrypted transcripts and the digital blackmail strategy Trevor had mapped out. I forced her to read the exact words her husband had written. I showed her the undeniable proof that Trevor had intentionally placed hidden cameras in their private bedroom. I laid out the extortion plot, explaining exactly how the man she loved had planned to sell her dignity, her body, and her pristine reputation to the highest bidder to save his own miserable life. I showed her that she was never a cherished wife. She was nothing more than a calculated insurance policy. Natalie dropped the papers. She stared at the horrifying evidence, her mouth open, in a silent scream of absolute devastation. The magnitude of the betrayal shattered the very foundation of her reality. But the deep, toxic roots of her entitlement had not yet been fully eradicated. After a long, agonizing silence, she looked up at me with wild, desperate eyes. She told me that this changed nothing about her immediate crisis. She argued that the embarrassment was too much to bear. She demanded that I use the vast fortune I was clearly hiding to pay off the syndicate, hire the best defense lawyers in the country, and sweep this entire catastrophic scandal under the rug. She insisted that we could still make it all go away with enough capital. I looked down at my daughter. I kept my voice entirely flat, stripping every ounce of emotion from my delivery. I told her no. I told her I would not transfer a single dollar to cover Trevor's criminal mess. I told her I would not buy her a new luxury car or rent her a penthouse apartment. I explained that for years I had financed her illusion of superiority. I had paid for the extravagant wedding, the designer clothes, and the elite lifestyle that blinded her to the true nature of the people she surrounded herself with. I told her that my money had made her weak, vain, and completely vulnerable to a predator like Trevor. I declared that the bank of Anthony Shaw was permanently closed. I offered her a room in my cabin and a hot meal, but I absolutely refused to fund her escape from reality. She was going to have to face the consequences of her choices, hit rock bottom, and learn how to survive on her own. The absolute finality of my refusal hung in the damp air of the cabin. Natalie stared at me, processing the fact that the invisible safety net she had relied on her entire life had just been violently ripped away. Her profound sorrow did not transform into understanding. It instantly mutated into a venomous, blinding rage. She sprang to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the wooden floorboards. Her hands clenched into tight fists. She reached down, grabbed the delicate porcelain teacup I had made for her, and hurled it with all her strength directly at the heavy stone fireplace. The cup shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, sending hot tea hissing and steaming across the cold hearth. She turned to face me, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. She screamed that I was a cold-blooded, heartless monster. She accused me of enjoying her suffering. She yelled that a real father would never abandon his daughter in her darkest hour. She told me that she wished she had never been born into my family. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest and declared that I was dead to her. She swore she would never speak to me again, that she would rather starve in the streets than spend another second in my presence. Without waiting for a response, Natalie spun on her heels. She marched aggressively toward the entryway, tore the heavy oak door open, and threw herself back out into the freezing, torrential downpour. She did not look back. I stood perfectly still in the center of the silent living room, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading into the chaotic roar of the storm. I looked at the shattered porcelain resting on the hearth. My heart bled for the pain she was about to endure, but my mind remained absolutely resolute. The agonizing process of her true awakening had officially begun. 4 months dissolved into the bitter chill of late autumn. The vibrant colors of the forest surrounding my cabin had long since stripped away, leaving bare branches that scraped against the gray sky. Inside my study, the environment remained perfectly controlled, but the contents of the weekly dossiers resting on my mahogany desk painted a picture of absolute grueling survival. Marcus and his private intelligence team had maintained a flawless, invisible perimeter around Natalie. I read every page, examined every photograph, and traced every painful step of her brutal descent into the real world. She had quickly discovered that a life built entirely on social media prestige and the illusion of inherited wealth offered zero currency when the rent was due. Without my signature on her credit accounts, and without the hollow status of her fraudulent husband, Natalie had crashed into the concrete floor of reality. She had tried to leverage her elite connections at first. The reports detailed her desperate visits to the polished corporate offices of her former friends seeking marketing positions or public relations roles. The rejections were swift and universal. The people who had gladly drank her champagne and complimented her designer gowns suddenly had no available positions for a woman carrying the toxic, highly public scandal of Trevor Evans. She possessed no practical degree, no tangible skills, and a resume composed entirely of vanity projects. Hunger and the looming threat of eviction had finally forced her to abandon the high society fantasy. The photographs in the latest dossier showed my daughter standing behind the scratched plexiglass counter of a 24-hour convenience store on the edge of the industrial district. She wore a shapeless, hideous green polyester uniform vest. Her hair, once meticulously styled by expensive salons, was pulled back into a tight, messy knot. But it was the photograph of her feet that held my attention the longest. I stared at the zoomed-in image of her worn, scuffed sneakers. The soles were peeling. The canvas was stained with floor wax, and the heels were completely ground down from standing on hard linoleum for 10 hours a day. Looking at those ruined shoes, I did not see a tragic fall from grace. I saw a mirror reflecting my own past. I remembered being 20 years old, standing in the freezing mud of a construction site with boots that offered no protection against the biting cold. I remembered the agonizing blisters, the aching arches, and the profound bone-deep exhaustion that settled into my spine every single night. Those worn shoes were not a punishment. They were a crucible. The sweat of manual labor and the stinging reality of minimum wage were systematically washing away the thick layers of fake aristocratic arrogance that had poisoned her mind for years. She was finally learning the true, undeniable weight of a single dollar. She was learning how to survive. Watching her endure this agonizing process was the most difficult task I had ever undertaken. Every paternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to drive my car to that miserable store, pull her out from behind the register, and bring her home to a warm bed and a full refrigerator. It took every ounce of my willpower to remain seated in my study. I knew that if I intervened, if I offered her a single drop of unearned comfort, the fire would instantly die out. She would revert back to the helpless, entitled victim waiting to be rescued by a man with a checkbook. I was not the only one struggling with the harshness of this lesson. Late on a Tuesday afternoon, I received a secure phone call from Douglas, one of my oldest friends, and a senior logistics director within the Vanguard Horizon conglomerate. Douglas had known Natalie since she was a little girl running through my carpentry shop. He had seen her recently walking in the rain toward the bus stop, looking exhausted and malnourished. His heart had broken for her. Douglas confessed that he had quietly arranged to bypass the standard hiring protocols. He was preparing to offer Natalie a comfortable, high-paying administrative role at a subsidiary office under a fake corporate umbrella. He wanted to give her a soft landing out of pure pity. I stopped him immediately. My voice was calm, but the directive was absolute. I forbade Douglas from making the offer. He argued with me, his voice tight with emotion, asking how I could be so cruel as to let my own flesh and blood scrub sticky floors for pennies when I owned half the commercial real estate in the city. I explained to my oldest friend that true love is not about providing a painless existence. I told him the story of the old master carpenter who had refused to loan me money to pay my rent, forcing me to earn my survival through blistered hands and raw determination. I told Douglas that handing Natalie a sanitized, comfortable job would be equivalent to handing her a poisoned apple. It would teach her that she did not have to earn her salvation. It would teach her that whenever she ruined her life, a powerful man would simply wave a magic wand and make the consequences disappear. I ordered Douglas to stand down and let the fire do its work. He reluctantly agreed, though I knew he thought I was a heartless monster. He did not understand that I was forging steel. Natalie did not quit the convenience store. The intelligence reports indicated that despite the grueling hours, the rude customers, and the physical exhaustion, she showed up for every single scheduled shift. She learned how to count the register till. She learned how to mop the aisles. She learned how to swallow her pride when drunken patrons insulted her over the price of cheap cigarettes. The vanity that Trevor had so easily manipulated was burning away, leaving behind a hardened, quiet resilience. She was building a spine one miserable hour at a time. The true test of that newly forged spine arrived on a bitterly cold Thursday night. Natalie was working the midnight to 6 morning shift. The convenience store was located in a rough transition zone, a gray area where the polished commercial district bled into the neglected industrial harbor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glare over the linoleum floor she had just finished mopping. Outside, a thick, freezing fog had rolled off the water, obscuring the streetlights and isolating the small store in a bubble of damp darkness. Marcus had stationed a discreet surveillance operative across the street, in an unmarked sedan, strictly ordered to observe and only intervene if her life was in imminent physical danger. I listened to the live audio feed patched through to my secure servers. The store was dead quiet. Natalie was standing behind the counter, organizing a display of cheap lighters, her movements slow and heavy with fatigue. The electronic chime above the glass entrance door rang out with a sharp, jarring noise. The heavy door swung open, letting in a gust of freezing fog, heavy air. Heavy boots slammed against the freshly cleaned floor. 2 men walked into the store. The audio feed picked up the low, aggressive rumble of their voices before they even reached the counter. They were large, broad-shouldered men wearing dark leather jackets that smelled of stale tobacco and damp pavement. They did not walk like ordinary customers looking for a late-night snack. They moved with the predatory, entitled swagger of men who were used to taking whatever they wanted through sheer intimidation. These were not random street thugs. They were foot soldiers. They were the bottom-feeding enforcers belonging to the exact same illegal loan shark syndicate that Trevor had owed his massive gambling debt to. While I had officially purchased Trevor's debt and neutralized the threat at the executive level, the violent ripples of his pathetic life had not completely faded from the streets. These men had likely been part of the crew originally tasked with hunting Trevor down before the debt was magically wiped clean from their boss's ledger. They recognized the beautiful high society wife from the photographs they had been given months ago. They approached the plexiglass counter. One of them, a man with a thick, jagged scar running along his jawline, slammed a heavy hand down on the metal display rack. He leaned close to the glass, a cruel, mocking grin stretching across his face. He called Natalie by her full name. He asked her how a fancy rich girl ended up slinging cheap coffee in the gutter. The second man laughed a harsh grating sound and casually knocked a row of candy bars onto the wet floor just to watch her reaction. The scar-faced man leaned even closer, his voice dropping into a menacing, predatory whisper. He told her that her deadbeat husband might have found a miraculous guardian angel to buy his kneecaps back, but they still remembered the trouble Trevor had caused their operation. He suggested that since Trevor was gone, maybe his pretty little wife owed them a personal apology. He told her to step out from behind the protective glass. The isolation of the foggy night pressed against the store windows. The silence stretched tight, heavy with the terrifying promise of violence. I sat in my study, my hand hovering over the communication button that would send Marcus's operative crashing through the front door, waiting to see if my daughter would break or if she would finally stand her ground. The scar-faced man slapped his heavy palm against the thick plexiglass shield. The brutal sound echoed through the sterile, fluorescent-lit convenience store like a gunshot, shattering the quiet hum of the refrigerators. The second man, the one who had just casually swept a row of candy bars onto the wet linoleum floor, leaned his elbows against the counter. He smiled a jagged, nicotine-stained smile, his eyes tracing the exhaustion etched deep into my daughter's face. They thought they were dealing with a terrified, pampered princess who had accidentally fallen from her ivory tower. They expected her to dissolve into tears. They expected her to drop to her knees, cover her face, and beg for mercy. They demanded Trevor's remaining underground debt, insisting that as his legal wife she was left holding the bloody bag for his cowardly sins. The scar-faced man grew tired of her silence. He reached into his dark leather jacket, pulled out a heavy metal flashlight, and slammed it violently against the plastic barrier separating them. The thick acrylic cracked loudly, sending a jagged spiderweb of white lines across Natalie's line of sight. He yelled that Trevor might have found a mysterious billionaire to buy his primary debt, but there was still a massive amount of street interest to be paid. He told her she was going to empty the cash register, hand over the keys to her car, and figure out a way to pay them $10,000 by the end of the week. If she refused, he promised they would wait for her in the dark alley behind her apartment every single night. The threat was raw, visceral, and terrifyingly immediate. Natalie stood entirely frozen for a fraction of a second. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat. The old Natalie, the woman from 4 months ago, would have crumbled into a puddle of absolute hysterics. She would have frantically fumbled for her phone, dialed my number, and pleaded for a massive financial rescue. She would have offered them anything to make the ugly reality of the world go away. But something ancient, fierce, and entirely dormant awoke inside her chest. As the thug raised his heavy weapon to strike the glass a second time, Natalie felt a sudden, absolute clarity wash over her panicked mind. This unyielding resilience did not come from my side of the family. It came entirely from her mother. My late wife had been a woman of quiet, terrifying strength. She had grown up with absolutely nothing, fighting tooth and nail for every single inch of ground she stood on. She had never once bowed her head to intimidation, and she had never allowed a louder, more violent voice to silence her own. That same iron blood was currently pumping through Natalie's veins. The superficial, fragile layers of high society vanity had been brutally burned away by months of mopping filthy floors, counting pennies for groceries, and standing on aching feet. What remained beneath the ashes of her old life was a pure, unbreakable survival instinct. Natalie did not reach for her cell phone. She did not shed a single tear. Without breaking eye contact with the man threatening to destroy her, she slowly slid her left hand beneath the checkout counter. Her fingers traced the underside of the wood until they found the red plastic casing of the silent security alarm. She pressed the button, firmly holding it down for 3 deliberate seconds. Then her right hand moved lower, reaching into the dark, narrow space beside the cash drawer. The store owner kept a solid steel tire iron hidden there for night shift emergencies. Natalie gripped the freezing cold metal shaft. She pulled it up and brought it down hard on the top of the counter. The heavy, ringing metallic clang echoed violently over the buzzing lights, a sharp declaration of war. The 2 thugs stopped laughing instantly. The scar-faced man blinked, genuinely surprised by the sudden display of aggression. Natalie stepped right up to the cracked plexiglass. Her voice was not shaking. It was cold, deep, and absolutely steady. She told them that Trevor Evans was a pathetic coward who had ruined his own life, and she did not owe them a single dime of his miserable gambling debt. She raised the heavy steel bar slightly, her knuckles turning white with tension. She informed them that she had precisely $0 to her name, absolutely nothing left to lose, and not a single ounce of hesitation about swinging the iron bar through the gap in the glass if they tried to cross the counter. She stood her ground, a lone woman, in a cheap, shapeless polyester vest, radiating a lethal, desperate energy that completely paralyzed her attackers. The thugs exchanged a look of pure confusion. They were used to preying on fear, not defiant, calculated rage. Before they could decide whether to call her bluff or retreat into the fog, the blaring, high-pitched wail of police sirens pierced the freezing night air. Red and blue lights violently strobed across the convenience store windows, cutting through the darkness and illuminating the aisles in frantic bursts of color. Stephen Blake had executed his assignment flawlessly. While he was strictly forbidden from interfering with Natalie's daily struggles or offering her financial aid, he had utilized his extensive city connections to place her store on a high-priority patrol route with the local police precinct. He ensured an immediate, overwhelming tactical response the moment the silent alarm was triggered. 3 police cruisers skidded to a violent halt on the wet pavement outside the glass doors. Heavily armed officers stormed the entrance, shouting commands and drawing their weapons. The 2 syndicate enforcers did not even try to run. They dropped their hands, stepped away from the counter, and were immediately shoved against the wall. The police handcuffed them forcefully and dragged them out into the pouring rain. Natalie did not collapse when the police finally left the building. She gave her official statement to the responding detective with a calm, clinical precision. She did not tremble, and she did not ask for a glass of water. When the officers cleared the scene, she quietly swept up the candy bars, wiped down the counter, and finished the remaining 3 hours of her shift. The absolute terror of the night had not broken her spirit. It had permanently solidified it. She had looked a legitimate physical threat directly in the eye and realized she did not need a billionaire father to survive. She had saved herself. The next morning, the heavy storm broke. The sun pierced through the gray clouds, casting a bright, cold light over the city skyline. I was sitting at my mahogany desk in the study reading the brief confidential police report Marcus had forwarded to my secure server. A profound, overwhelming sense of paternal pride swelled in my chest, entirely erasing the anxiety of the past 4 months. My daughter had walked through the fire and emerged as forged steel. The silence of the room was broken by my personal phone vibrating on the desk. I looked down at the screen. The caller ID displayed Natalie's name. I took a slow, steadying breath and answered the call. I did not hear the frantic, entitled whine of a spoiled heiress. I heard a voice that was grounded, quiet, and deeply mature. She did not ask for a loan. She did not ask for a favor or a shortcut out of her current reality. She simply asked if I was free that afternoon. She told me there was a small, quiet diner down the street from her apartment. She wanted to invite me for a cup of coffee, and she made it absolutely clear that she was going to pay the bill using her own money. The late morning sun hung low over the city, casting long, pale shadows across the cracked pavement of the diner parking lot. It was a modest place nestled between a laundromat and a hardware store, smelling faintly of roasted coffee beans and old grease. I parked my truck and walked toward the entrance. Through the smudged glass window, I saw her. Natalie was sitting in a booth near the back. She wore a simple gray sweater and faded denim. Her hands were wrapped tightly around a thick ceramic mug. She did not look like the pristine corporate socialite who had once scoffed at my flannel shirts and vintage tools. She looked tired. She looked worn. She looked entirely real. I walked inside, listening to the dull chime of the doorbell, and slid into the vinyl booth across from her. She pushed a steaming mug of black coffee across the scratched table toward me. She told me she remembered exactly how I took it. No sugar, no cream, just bitter and strong. I looked at the dark liquid, then up at my daughter. The bruised, exhausted bags under her eyes told the story of the past 4 months better than any private intelligence report ever could. She took a slow, steadying breath. She did not start the conversation by complaining about her sore feet, her tiny apartment, or the grueling shifts at the convenience store. She looked me directly in the eyes, and she apologized. Her voice did not waver. It was grounded in a deep, agonizing clarity that only comes from surviving total devastation. She told me she had been incredibly foolish and utterly blind. She admitted that she had let vanity and the desperate pursuit of high society status blind her to the absolute cruelty of the man she had married. She apologized for the way she had treated me over the past year. She apologized for viewing me as a limitless bank account rather than a father, and for throwing a violent tantrum when I refused to fund her illusions on that terrible rainy night. She told me that standing behind that cash register, facing down the violent men her husband had brought to her door, had made her realize how truly fragile her previous life had been. I listened to her words in absolute silence. My heart swelled with a profound, overwhelming pride, but I kept my expression perfectly neutral. For decades, I had navigated the treacherous, bloodthirsty waters of global finance. I had seen massive generational fortunes completely destroy the children who inherited them. Wealth given without effort is a toxic poison that rots the human soul from the inside out. Money can buy a fleeting illusion of power, but it can never purchase genuine respect. Dignity is not inherited. It is forged in the grueling fires of survival. It is built by waking up in the dark, standing on aching feet, and facing the harsh, unforgiving reality of the world without a safety net to catch your fall. Natalie had walked through that fire. The fake aristocratic arrogance had been completely burned away by the sweat of honest labor. The woman sitting across from me was someone I could finally respect. I reached across the table and covered her trembling hands with my own. I told her that her apology was accepted in full. I told her that hitting rock bottom was a terrifying experience, but it was also a solid, undeniable foundation upon which she could finally build something real. I did not mention Vanguard Horizon. I did not tell her that I owned the bank that froze her assets or the corporate properties she walked past every day. That massive, invisible empire would remain a closely guarded secret. Revealing it now would instantly destroy the incredible progress she had made and revert her back to a life of dependency. Instead, I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out a simple brown manila envelope. I slid it across the table. Natalie looked at it warily, perhaps expecting a check or a wad of cash to bail her out of her miserable apartment. I told her to open it. She carefully unsealed the flap and pulled out a stack of registration documents. They were not deeds to a luxury condo or keys to a new European sports car. They were enrollment papers for an evening business management program at the local state college. The tuition had been paid in full for the first semester, but nothing more. I looked at her and explained my terms. I told her that I would not pay her rent, and I would not buy her groceries. She would have to continue working her shifts at the convenience store to survive. But if she was truly ready to learn how the world actually operated, I would gladly provide her with the tools to educate herself. I told her that a real career is not handed out at cocktail parties or acquired through marriage. It is built through late nights, aggressive studying, and relentless discipline. Natalie stared at the papers in her hands. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but it was not a tear of disappointment or anger. It was a tear of profound, genuine gratitude. She folded the papers securely, placed them into her bag, looked up at me and said, "Thank you." It was the most beautiful, authentic sound I had heard in years. We sat together in the quiet diner drinking our coffee, two adults finally understanding one another. While Natalie was meticulously rebuilding her life from the ground up, the man who had tried to destroy us both was finally colliding with absolute, unforgiving justice. 6 weeks later, the federal trial of Trevor Evans reached its inevitable, crushing conclusion. The courtroom was packed cold and strictly formal. Trevor sat at the defense table, his expensive tailored suits replaced by a shapeless, drab institutional uniform. The arrogant sneer that had once defined his entire existence had been entirely wiped away. He looked hollow, terrified, and incredibly small. The gallery behind him was completely empty. Not a single one of his elite corporate colleagues or high society friends had bothered to show up to support him. The mountain of irrefutable evidence Stephen Blake had meticulously compiled and handed over to the authorities was simply insurmountable. The jury had watched the high-definition security footage of his violent drug-induced rampage in my cabin. They had reviewed the fraudulent medical documents he had attempted to purchase from a federal informant. They had traced every single dollar of the illegal gambling debts he had tried to cover by stealing from an old man he believed was helpless. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for predatory behavior, did not mince her words when it was time to deliver the verdict. She looked down from the high wooden bench and described Trevor as a manipulative, parasitic danger to society. She stated that his complete lack of remorse, his extensive history of financial fraud, and his willingness to sacrifice his own wife to an illegal syndicate for financial gain demonstrated a profound moral bankruptcy. She made it absolutely clear that men who prey on the vulnerability of others have no place in a civilized society. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with a sharp, echoing crack. The sentence was absolute. Trevor Evans was condemned to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There would be no early parole, no corporate bailouts, and no slick lawyers to save him. The heavy steel handcuffs locked around his wrists with a cold metallic snap. He cast one final desperate look toward the gallery as the armed bailiffs dragged him toward the holding cells. He was frantically searching for a sympathetic face, hoping to find just one more victim left to manipulate. He found absolutely nothing. He was dragged through the heavy oak doors, disappearing forever into the dark, unforgiving system he had rightfully earned. The dust had finally settled over the sprawling, complex landscape of my life. The transition of seasons brought a profound, absolute stillness to the city and to the deep woods that surrounded my home. The chaotic noise that had plagued my existence for over a year was completely eradicated, replaced by a steady, mechanical rhythm of progress and recovery. Down in the towering glass and steel monoliths of the financial district, Vanguard Horizon continued its relentless expansion. Douglas had officially taken the public helm as the chief executive officer. He navigated the vicious boardroom politics, the aggressive corporate mergers, and the relentless media inquiries with the practiced grace of a seasoned veteran. The financial press praised his visionary leadership, attributing the soaring stock prices and the aggressive international acquisitions to his singular genius. I allowed them to believe every single word of it. The spotlight is a dangerous, blinding place, and I had absolutely no desire to step back into its burning glare. I remained the invisible architect, the silent majority shareholder who dictated the movements of the empire from the safety of the shadows. The illusion of my retirement was completely secure, and my privacy was an impenetrable fortress. My greatest victory, however, was not reflected in corporate dividends or climbing profit margins. It was found in the quiet, unassuming weekly reports Marcus continued to deliver to my mahogany desk. Natalie had honored the silent contract we established in that small diner. She did not quit her grueling shifts at the convenience store when her evening business classes began. She worked through her physical exhaustion, fueled by a newly discovered burning determination that I had never seen in her before. When she finally earned her business management certificate, there was no grand celebration or expensive champagne. She used her own modest savings to buy a simple, unbranded gray suit and began interviewing for entry-level positions across the city. She faced countless rejections, but she did not break. Eventually, she secured a position at a mid-sized shipping firm entirely outside of my sphere of influence. Her starting salary was a fraction of what she used to spend on a single designer handbag, but she guarded every paycheck with fierce, undeniable pride. I watched her incredible transformation from afar, reading the detailed updates with a swelling sense of paternal satisfaction. I saw surveillance photographs of her waiting at the city bus stop in the biting morning cold, holding a battered thermos of coffee she had brewed in her tiny apartment. She no longer chased the fleeting toxic approval of the high society parasites who had so quickly abandoned her when Trevor was arrested. She built genuine relationships with her coworkers, people who respected her relentless work ethic, rather than the assumed weight of her last name. The fragile, superficial girl who had demanded to be rescued was entirely gone. In her place stood a resilient, capable woman who knew exactly how to survive the crushing weight of the real world. She had finally learned that true dignity cannot be inherited, gifted, or bought with a platinum credit card. It must be forged in the bitter, unforgiving fires of personal responsibility. I had stripped her of her vast wealth, but in doing so I had handed her the key to her own salvation. Her worn-out shoes had become badges of honor identical to the boots I had worn when I was a desperate young man trying to carve out a place in a hostile world. Many people fundamentally misunderstand the nature of silence. Throughout the darkest months of this grueling ordeal, my refusal to engage in loud, dramatic confrontations was frequently misinterpreted. Trevor had looked at my quiet demeanor and seen a weak, senile old man ripe for the slaughter. Even my own daughter had once mistaken my deliberate patience for cowardice or tragic indifference. They believed that power was measured by the volume of a voice, the aggressive posturing in a boardroom, or the extravagant display of inherited wealth. They were completely and devastatingly wrong. A father's silence is never cowardice. It is the necessary calculated calm before a hurricane. It is the absolute terrifying discipline required to observe the battlefield, identify the toxic infections, and prepare the surgical instruments needed to cut the rot away. If I had shouted, if I had lost my temper and thrown my money at the problem the moment Trevor revealed his true nature, the parasites would have simply adapted and returned with a better strategy. By remaining absolutely silent, I allowed them to dig their own graves and willingly step inside. With the surgical operation complete, I returned permanently to my rustic wooden cabin. This isolated structure in the deep woods had been the stage for Trevor's most sinister drug-induced betrayal. He had tried to turn my sanctuary into a prison, a place where he could secretly record my supposed descent into madness and legally strip me of my empire. Now the cabin was entirely purged of his toxic memory. It was simply a home again. The heavy timber walls offered a profound, comforting isolation that no luxury penthouse could ever match. The air inside smelled of sharp pine wood smoke and damp earth, entirely free from the suffocating perfumes of the corporate elite. I walked into the modest kitchen and filled my old copper kettle with fresh spring water. I placed it on the cast iron stove and waited for the familiar comforting whistle. I did not need a staff of private chefs, a fleet of luxury vehicles, or a towering building with my name on it to feel secure. I had everything I required right here in the quiet, uncompromising isolation of the forest. I poured the boiling water over a simple blend of dark tea leaves and carried the steaming ceramic mug into the living room. I walked over to my heavy leather armchair, the one positioned perfectly beside the large window overlooking the wild, untamed garden. I sat down slowly, feeling the deep, familiar comfort of the worn leather supporting my tired bones. The silence in the room was not empty or lonely. It was full, rich, and deeply satisfying. It was the distinct sound of a completely restored order. The violent syndicate debts were eradicated from my family. The blackmailers were permanently neutralized. The corporate empire was fortified and thriving under loyal leadership, and the arrogant man who had tried to destroy my legacy was locked in a cold, concrete cell, entirely forgotten by the world he had tried to conquer. I looked out through the thick glass pane as the late afternoon transitioned seamlessly into evening. The sky above the dark tree line began to ignite with a brilliant, fading golden light. The autumn sun sank lower, casting long, peaceful shadows across the overgrown grass and the sturdy, ancient oak trees that guarded my property. The brilliant golden hues slowly bled into deep purples and quiet grays, signaling the end of the day and the definitive end of my longest, most exhausting battle. I took a slow sip of the hot, bitter tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest and settle my breathing. I had successfully protected the immense fortune I had spent my entire life building with my own bare hands, but more importantly, I had protected my dignity and my honor. I had saved my daughter's soul by walking the absolute harshest, most unforgiving path a parent could ever choose to walk. I closed my eyes as the last warm rays of golden sunlight washed over my tired face. The brutal storm had finally exhausted itself completely. The dangerous debris had been swept away by the flood. Absolute, undeniable peace had returned to my life, and the story was finally perfectly complete. True wealth is not measured by the vast numbers sitting in an offshore bank account, but by the undeniable resilience and strength of one's character. Handing a person an effortless, fully funded life only breeds toxic entitlement and dangerous weakness. Sometimes the most profound and courageous act of love a parent can offer is the strict refusal to rescue their child from the immediate consequences of their own foolish choices. By allowing them to face genuine hardship, you give them the rare opportunity to forge their own dignity, discover true independence, and build the inner strength required to survive any storm the world throws at them. If you found value in this story of resilience, discipline, and hard-won wisdom, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more compelling life lessons.